Right, we now come to the statement on Ukraine. I call the First Secretary, David Lammy.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will make a statement on Ukraine. In January 2022, I visited the Wall of Remembrance of the Fallen in Kyiv with my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary. Seeing the faces of all of those who had lost their lives since 2014 brought home the human cost of Kremlin imperialism and Ukrainian determination to stand up to it. And indeed, some weeks later, just as British and American intelligence services had warned, we awoke to news of Putin's full-scale invasion launched to shatter the sovereign state of Ukraine. Today we mark 3 years of Ukrainian courage in resisting. That brutal, illegal, unprovoked invasion. I have witnessed their fortitude firsthand on 3 visits to Kyiv over the last year. Their defiant blitz spirit as Russian missiles and drones rain down night after night after night. So on this grim anniversary, amid all the talk about talks, we must not forget that Russia's barbaric war goes on. That Ukrainian people are suffering, and beyond Europe, the conflict is piling pressure on the world's poorest too. Mr. Speaker, this debate takes place against a backdrop of intense diplomatic efforts, responding, of course, to President Trump's call to bring this war to a swift end. At the G20 in South Africa last week, I listened to Sergei Lavrov. Once again, he shamelessly played the victim, rehashing the same old lies. And I will say to this House what I said in response. If Russia is serious about a lasting peace that respects Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine's independence, and the United Nations Charter, guarantees Ukraine's security against future aggression, rejects imperialism, then Britain will listen. No one wants this more than Ukraine. And at the Munich Security Conference, I underlined that Ukraine must be at the heart of any talks about Ukraine's future. And I said the West must learn from our history. Vladimir Putin and his war is no historical aberration. He draws on a Tsarist tradition, the imperialism and authoritarianism of Peter the Great or Nicholas I, and a Soviet tradition. He is, after all, a KGB agent who operates by deception. It was an American diplomat, Mr. Speaker, George Kennan, who warned in 1947 of a deep continuity in Kremlin thinking. It's referred to as the long telegram. He argued that they would only respond to strength, and that was the basis for the policy of containment, a part of which Britain contributed tens of thousands of troops to the British Army of the Rhine. It was this strength, not paper promises, which deterred Moscow from further advances west. Today, let us look at the Kremlin's recent record. The Helsinki Final Act of 1975, betrayed. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994, betrayed. The NATO-Russian Founding Act of 1997, betrayed. The Minsk Agreement of 2014 and 2015, betrayed. This is foreign policy by lies. And we must respond by being true to ourselves and provide the support Ukraine needs to stay strong. Because that is what is needed to secure a lasting peace and to shape our collective security so that Putin never invades again. The UK has a unique role in helping to shape and make this happen. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, was in Paris last week talking to our European allies about how we step up support for Ukraine, accelerate work on security guarantees, and take more responsibility for the security of our continent. And in Munich, I spoke to Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio. While in Brussels, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, chaired the Ukraine's Defence Contact Group, where US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed that, like us, the US wants to see a sovereign, prosperous Ukraine. Europe must shoulder its share of the burden. With the United States and their unique capabilities, we can deter Putin from attacking Ukraine again, from escalating hybrid Russian attacks in Europe into some form of direct confrontation. So this week, the Prime Minister and I will be travelling to Washington, DC, to meet President Trump. Ukraine needs friends and allies on both sides of the Atlantic working together to achieve peace through strength. Both President Trump and President Zelensky have spoken of their desire to achieve this. And the Prime Minister will reaffirm to Zelensky in a call today that this is Britain's goal as well. This must include European countries investing more in our own defence and capabilities. Already, the UK has stepped up and sped up military assistance. We've committed $3 billion in military aid a year, every year, for as long as it takes. And over the next 2 years, we will provide an additional $2.26 billion earmarked for military spending via our share of the $50 billion G7 loan backed by frozen Russian assets. In addition, as the Prime Minister has made clear, we know our Kremlin history, which is why we're ready to contribute to future security guarantees for Ukraine in the context of a US backstop, including by putting our own troops on the ground if necessary. That would not be an easy decision. Anyone in this House who has taken responsibility for the lives of British servicemen and women can attest to that. Yet I know the whole House recognises that Ukraine's security is our security. The UK also continues to set the pace on ratcheting up the economic pressure on the Kremlin. Together with our international partners, we have already denied Russia access to $400 billion. Their war economy is increasingly unsustainable. Inflation is 9.9% and rising. That's just the official figure, of course. Interest rates are running at 21%. And this year, Russia will spend almost 41% of its budget on defence and security. Today, Mr. Speaker, we're announcing our biggest package of sanctions since the early days of the war. Over 100 targets, including 40 oil tankers, our largest set of ship specifications in a single sanctions package yet, as well as third country enablers pouring money into Putin's war chest, and new legislation imposing additional trade sanctions on Russia too. This will deny Russia access to world-leading expertise needed to maintain its war. And today, the UK is also solidifying our historic 100-year partnership with Ukraine. Signed by the Prime Minister and President Zelensky in Kyiv in January. In February, I saw for myself how much this partnership means to Ukraine and how much potential there is for our collective growth and security. Together, we lay that agreement in Parliament for scrutiny, and I look forward to it entering into force when that process is complete, a clear sign of our confidence in Ukraine's future. Mr. Speaker, this is a critical moment. I want to acknowledge how colleagues have stood united these past 3 years, honourable members from all parties, as well as noble lords in the other place, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, several predecessors as Foreign Secretary, I'm proud of this unity. It's a tribute to our country. Proud of this country's unwavering support to our Ukrainian friends. Proud that the United Kingdom is rightly taking on the responsibility of bringing our allies together. That is how we confront a foreign policy based on lies. How we secure Ukraine's future, secure Europe's future, and face down a Kremlin dictator once again. Slava Ukraini. I commend this statement to the House.
So the Foreign Secretary, Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Foreign Secretary for his statement and the advanced sight of it as well. Because, Mr. Speaker, the House stands united with Ukraine on this absolutely grim milestone. 3 years on from Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we all think of the innocent lives caught up in this terrible conflict. The civilians mercilessly killed in towns such as Bucha and Irpin and in the east. The young Ukrainian children forcibly deported to Russia. The families of brave troops who have not returned alive from the front line. And all of those, Mr. Speaker, with life-changing injuries. And those who have lost their homes and possessions. When the war started, the UK led the global efforts to back Ukraine and to rightly punish Putin. From training tens of thousands of Ukrainian recruits on British soil, to donating Challenger 2 battle tanks and Storm Shadow missiles, to being part of an unprecedented international sanctions response that has deprived Putin's regime of $400 billion, to being one of the first countries to provide Ukraine with that multi-billion, multi-year pound funding pledge in military aid. The UK has led the way for Ukraine. And our support has made a material difference to Ukraine's ability to hold the line. Never forget that the cost of this war to Putin has been catastrophic. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has been pummeled, and it is likely by the summer that Russia will have incurred 1 million casualties, with Putin desperately turning to North Korea for troops and to Iran for weapons. Meanwhile, as we've heard, Russia's economy is in dire straits. There have been uprisings against Putin's regime, and the central pitch of his leadership, that he was the great restorer of Russia's stability, lies in ruins. Mr. Speaker, the British public continue to rightly stand resolutely with Ukraine, and they expect us as politicians across this House to do so. And I just want to thank again the many thousands who have so generously opened up their homes to Ukrainians fleeing the war, including through the Homes to Ukraine scheme. Genuinely, they've showed the best of our country, the best of Britain. Mr. Speaker, although there has been much debate, and we've heard already, about the course of the conflict in recent days, this war continues to rage. And I urge the government, rightly so, to continue giving Ukraine everything they need, all the hardware they need, and all the diplomatic support to strengthen their hand. And I'm sure the Foreign Secretary with the Prime Minister will do that in Washington this week. There must be no let-up whatsoever. We welcome the announcement today on new sanctions. And can the Foreign Secretary confirm that there are no plans to lift sanctions in the future? And if he discusses the use particularly of sanctions when he goes to Washington this week, and the role of the United States on this sanctions policy, can the Foreign Secretary give us an assurance and update us on whether we should expect to see any new resources and support, either in terms of military aid or humanitarian support in the coming weeks? Now is the time for Britain to lead, as the Foreign Secretary has said, as we did from day one, and ensure that Ukraine is in the best possible position to decide its own future. We should be very clear. It remains ultimately for Ukraine, as a proud and sovereign nation that has sacrificed so much to defend itself, to decide its own future, and that's peace through strength. We want this terrible war to be brought to an end, and like President Zelensky, we want a lasting, reliable and just peace. But the Euro-Atlantic community must continue to be intensely robust in the face of Putin's aggression, because a lesson of the last 20 years is clear, that he only comes back for more. We must ensure that this illegal invasion like this can never happen again. We need a stronger deterrence. We recognise the Prime Minister has commented on the options and the security guarantees in recent days, and I can assure the House that His Majesty's opposition stands ready to engage with this government at every single level. We must lead our NATO allies in Europe, both in the long term. Collective defence and planning must be coordinated to back Ukraine in their fight for freedom. There is already, as the government will know, a fully funded plan to get to 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030 from the previous government. And I would strongly urge this government to at least look at a minimum plan to match that commitment, and we will work with them in terms of how that is delivered, to set a new benchmark for other NATO countries to follow, and to fire up everything that we can on defence production. The US also knows that the UK has an influential role in NATO, and I'm sure the Foreign Secretary will be discussing that this week. I would also just like to say that in light of this target for 2.5%, it's not a goal in itself, it's an important step on that journey to increase the strength of our defence spending. And given the threats our nation faces, I would urge the government, and in fact the Foreign Secretary, because this is within his purview and his department, to review and repurpose some of the 0.5% currently spent on ODA to further our national defence and safety and security. Finally, the moral and economic case for mobilising sovereign assets of Russia to support Ukraine is very clear. The Foreign Secretary has spoken about this already. I would urge the government to do more. Mr. Speaker, we stand united as one house. Slava Ukraine.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for the unity she demonstrated once again in this chamber on this subject. And I can confirm to her that, of course, all hardware and military support, all diplomatic support, all humanitarian support continues, and we continue to discuss these issues with our European partners, particularly at meetings at the Munich Security Conference and subsequently, and will continue to do that to ensure that we put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. She rightly mentions the British casualties over these last few years, and there have been 17 British nationals who have served as members of the armed forces of Ukraine who've been killed in action, and we remember them on this day. She also rightly mentions Ukraine and the solidarity that we continue to show with Ukraine. We continue to discuss sanctions, of course, with our European partners, and just as we have announced a sanction package today, the EU, following their meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council, have announced a sanctions package too. This is all to bear down on Putin's war machine. Can I confirm to her that we are continuing also to support Ukraine with an medical aid package for their men and women on the front line, and very grateful to the Defence Secretary for making further funds available in relation to that. And she rightly comments on defence spending. We're grateful for the unity that the official opposition is demonstrating on this issue. As we have said, it is very, very clear to all that Europe must pay a bigger part of the burden. In capitals right across the continent, leaders are considering these issues, and we have said we will come forward with our plan shortly, and we will. And of course, in this context, NATO, and we've seen this from the Secretary-General, have been very clear from both the burden sharing and the burden shifting environment that we are now in.
Tanmanjeet Singh Dhesi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In my role as Defence Committee Chair, I get the opportunity to meet many ambassadors, defence ministers, attachés and other stakeholders here in London, but also at events and gatherings like the Munich Security Conference. And there is considerable consternation and anxiety about whether, amongst them, about whether long-established and hard-earned alliances, rather than a short-term transactional approach, can still be relied upon. And given the reduced American presence, and as we mark the 3rd anniversary of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine, people are looking for leadership. And I feel that this is our time as a nation to take that lead on defence and security matters in our continent. Does my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, agree that it can be our Prime Minister who takes that lead in our continent while pulling together our transatlantic NATO and other allies in the process.
I'm
very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. The UK has been ironclad in its support for Ukraine. We have been forward-leaning as Ukraine's primary friend in Europe and across the world under successive governments. It is also the case that we have a special relationship with the United States. It's a special relationship underpinned by a lot of military and defence capability and support over many, many years, and of course a very close intelligence relationship. All of this we bring to bear in ensuring, of course, that we get a resolution to this terrible conflict, but the resolution that means that we have an enduring peace where Ukraine is at the centre of those discussions, and he should be absolutely sure that the UK intends to play its part, and it's why we will meet with Donald Trump this week, but also the Prime Minister has been at the centre of much shuttle diplomacy over this last period.
Just spokesperson Commonwealth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Today marks 3 years since Putin launched his barbaric, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Many people, including Putin, expected Russian tanks to capture Kyiv in days. Yet Putin failed to consider the resolve of the Ukrainian people. 3 years on, Ukrainians bravely continue the fight against Putin's imperialism in defence of their sovereignty. The UK and this House has stood together with Ukraine throughout these darkest hours. Across the country, people opened their homes to Ukrainian guests and demonstrated their opposition to Putin's war. We must continue to support Ukrainians living in the UK, including by providing urgent clarity on what permanent options to remain the government will introduce for them. The past week has, however, exposed the fragility of the West's support for Ukraine. In parroting the Kremlin's false claims that Ukraine started this war and that President Zelensky is a dictator, President Trump has shown that the US can't be trusted to support Ukraine's defence. That is why the UK, working with our continental allies, must step up to lead in Europe. This must include the UK committing to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence as soon as possible, and all parties working together to build a consensus on reaching 3%. The Liberal Democrats support the government's suggestion that British troops could join a reassurance mission in Ukraine if a just settlement is reached. This would depend on parliamentary approval for such military deployment. We also support the government's announcement today of new sanctions targeting Russian kleptocrats. I urge the Foreign Secretary to add the pro-Russian founder of Georgia Dream, Bidzina Ivanishvili, to that list. The government should also now move to seize the frozen Russian assets totalling £40 billion across the UK and Europe and channel these funds into Ukraine's defence. As a start, can the Foreign Secretary update the House on what is delaying the release of the £2.5 billion that was promised to Ukraine from the sale of Chelsea Football Club? This week in Washington, the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary must make clear that the UK will continue to stand side by side with Ukraine for as long as it takes to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. Slava Ukraini.
Foreign Secretary.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and can I say to him on his comments on President Trump that we share President Trump's desire to bring this barbaric war to an end. We know that Russia could do that by withdrawing its troops tomorrow, and President Trump agrees with us that it's important that Ukraine is at the table. And when I spoke to Secretary Rubio, he was absolutely clear that there can be no peace without Ukraine. In fact, he was also clear that because of the burden of UK and EU sanctions, there can not easily be a resolution to this conflict without Europe at the table as well. He asked about sanctions and designations. I think combined across both parties, we've now got more sanctions in relation to this crime, frankly, and this terrible conflict than any other in our parliamentary history. I can't comment on future designations, but he will know, and he would have seen from my comments, that our desire is to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. We know that Putin has used his economy and turned his economy into a war economy, and we know that there are evasions that we will continue to bear down. And he rightly mentions the issue with Abramovich and that money that has been set aside, and we are redoubling our efforts to unlock that money that could be used for the front line to support Ukraine over the course of these next few months.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am sure that our Ukrainian allies will listen to the steadfast support in this House and feel heartened, and also notice whose voices are absent from the House at this point in time. But can I ask the Foreign Secretary, just with the press reports of a deal apparently imminent on the Ukrainian mineral deposits for America as the price of continued support, is there anything more that we and our European partners can do, and indeed has this issue been discussed, about how we can stop those eventual products, the crucial metals, ending up in the hands of our enemy and competitor states?
Well, the Honourable Lady asks a good question. And I actually discussed this issue with President Zelensky when I was in Ukraine a few days ago. We discussed it in the context of the 100-year partnership that we have just signed with Ukraine. And I do believe that that partnership, which is a unique document in our history, in Ukraine's history, but actually it's a unique document in the context of the world, sets a pretty good guide as to how to strike a relationship across many fronts, a relationship that, of course, will bring big wins for British business over the years ahead, but also for Ukrainian business. We will learn from their innovation. And look, I look forward to the discussions that Ukraine is having with the United States. It's for them to make their own judgments, but I do think the 100-year partnership could be a good guide.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for the robust and bipartisan approach that he's taking to this crisis. And in that spirit, can I say to him that if the government came forward with plans to reduce the number of adult welfare recipients just to 2019 levels, that would save £40 billion a year. It would mean that on Thursday, he and the Prime Minister could say to President Trump that we were increasing defence spending to 3% of GDP or even 3.4% of GDP as the United States itself does. That would not just secure the future of Ukraine, it would also secure the future of NATO, which is one of the most important challenges facing the government.
Foreign Secretary.
I recognise that the Right Honourable Gentleman brings tremendous experience to these matters, and he's put those views on the record and in the detailed conversations that, of course, go on across government. I'm sure that the Chancellor of the Exchequer will be looking very closely at them.
Debbie Abraham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's clear that the rules-based order established after the Second World War is under extreme threat from oppressors and bullies who think that they can just take what they want. And I'm not just talking about Putin. Why does my right honourable friend think that previous sanctions, and we did have a raft of sanctions brought in 2022, failed to curb Russia? And what more do we need to do to organisations who use different measures to circumvent them?
Secretary.
Well, the Right Honourable Lady refers to the rules-based order. It was an order that was set up not just for its own sake, but because of the tremendous bloodshed and loss of life, including many men and women in our own country who lost their lives across Europe and, of course, in the United States and allies. It served us well, and we have to ensure that we continue to protect it. And she rightly refers to the invasion that we've seen with the Russian shadow fleet. And it's part of the discussions that I have to have with certain states who facilitate this. And it's why also she will see, in the announcement I've made, more efforts to target dual-use technology that is finding its way out of countries like China and being used against Ukrainian men and women in that country.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We need to recognise that the environment in which we operate has changed fundamentally, and therefore our response must change fundamentally. And I very much echo my right honourable friend's calls to increase defence spending now, because we have to send a message to our friends and foes alike that we take defence seriously. And would I urge him to remember the commitments we made to the Ukrainian people when this full-scale invasion took place. Our support to them was not contingent on the support of others. It was absolute, and we should make good on that commitment, because we said things which encouraged the Ukrainians to put their sons and daughters in harm's way. They have stood up their end of the bargain. We should stand up ours.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right. We have been Ukraine's foremost friend. We will continue to do that. We have a key role to play because of our special relationship with the United States. And we understand here in Europe that, yes, we want this war to end, but we want an enduring peace. And we've got a long memory in relation to the Soviet Union and Tsarist history, and that guides us on how we secure that peace.
Paul Waugh.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This weekend I joined Rochdale's Ukrainian community, a proud, long-standing Ukrainian community, to mark the 3rd anniversary of Putin's illegal war, and also to remember all those who've lost their lives to Russian aggression. Our own father, Ben Likikovich, is today joining the PM in Downing Street. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that President Zelensky is a democrat, not a dictator, and the Ukrainian people can never again have their fate decided by other countries carving up their land, as has happened far too often in the past?
Foreign Secretary.
I'm very grateful. You know, I've met President Zelensky 6 or 7 times over this last period, and he has always struck me as the most courageous and brave of individuals, leading his people to self-determination. And that is something that I think we recognise right across the United Kingdom, and so we stand with him.
Mike Martin.
Speaker, I was at the Munich Security Conference, and at Munich it became clear to me when talking with our European allies that they no longer fully trust the Article 5 security guarantee. Put simply, they don't trust the Americans. Conversations naturally turned to what collective defence looks like in Europe without the Americans. And last night, Chancellor-elect Merz said that conversations are happening at the highest levels on precisely this. Will the Foreign Secretary comment on whether the UK is included in these conversations and what the content of them is?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I just say to the honourable gentleman, NATO has stood the test of time as the greatest modern-day alliance we've ever seen, and is strengthened further with Sweden and Finland joining NATO in this last period. And of course there is a debate in Europe. There is a debate about burden sharing, there is a debate about burden shifting, and there are some who think there's a debate about burden dumping. But it's a great alliance, and we work across that alliance, and successive US presidents, right back to Roosevelt, Obama, and of course President Trump, have rightly said that Europe have to do more, and that is now what we have to do.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, it has been mentioned about spending and GDP, and I think it's very clear from recent events that we cannot wait to 2030 to get to 2.5% of GDP. In fact, we should be exceeding that. But my question is this to the Foreign Secretary. In the lead-up to any negotiations, it's absolutely essential that we ensure that Ukraine is in its strongest possible position, and that includes militarily. Therefore, it's absolutely essential as well that we speed up help and support as quickly as possible. And with that in mind, I understand that the Ukrainian defence industrial base has capacity to increase their weapons and equipment production. Therefore, can we do more to get funding to their defence industrial base to ensure they can produce more equipment and weapons, whereas we're stuck at the point we have a problem in terms of our industrial base not being able to gear up that quickly?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend asked an excellent question about Ukraine's industrial base, and just to give an example of this, drone technology is improving at pace around the world, and the country leading that technology is Ukraine. We have much to learn. We've laid the 100-year partnership. That capacity and capability is part of that partnership, which he will be pleased about. But he's absolutely right. We can't wait. We've got to act now. That is what was being discussed when the Defence Secretary was in Ukraine a little while ago. And it's what I was discussing with Ukraine just in a few weeks. So, yes, we will accelerate how both our agencies work together and allocate the funds that are necessary.
Andrew Mitchell.
The whole House, Madam Deputy Speaker, will want to wish the Right Honourable Gentleman and the Prime Minister a strong and successful visit later this week. He will be able to agree with the President about the importance of all European members of NATO stepping up and playing their part in the very significant figure for increasing defence expenditure, which we all now require to see, while, of course, never forgetting what General Mattis has said about the important part of the mix that development spending plays in national defence. But I hope there will be no compromise in Washington on the facts of the matter, which are that a P5 member of the United Nations invaded its neighbour in an act we thought had gone out with the last century, has bombed and destroyed its infrastructure, and has butchered and murdered its citizens.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman reminds the House of the seriousness and the responsibilities that we have as permanent members of the UN Security Council. And we have that seriousness, and that seriousness is underpinned by the UN Charter, which was, of course, breached by Russia. And in doing so, it has made a serious hole in how the UN Security Council works. Let us get beyond that, but in order to do that, Russia should withdraw and should come to the table, really, with the central issue of peace and making amends at their heart.
Jeevun, Sandher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Keeping ourselves safe here means showing Putin we have the resolve and the resources to defeat him. And indeed, we do. In European NATO, our combined GDP around $24.5 trillion. The United States, $27 trillion. Russia has just $2 trillion of GDP. Shall we have more resources and convert them to more fighting forces, tanks, guns and drones is key. But we can go further. Central bank assets are held across ourselves and our allies. Over £200 billion in total, £170 billion in Belgium, £26 billion here, reserves that Putin could use in the future to rebuild his armed forces. So can the Minister assure me that he's doing everything he can to convince our allies to seize those assets, to keep us safe and to fund Ukraine?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman asked a good question. If we're serious about the responsibility of burden sharing across Europe and indeed G7 nations at this time, then one of the issues on the table is moving from freezing assets to seizing those assets. It's a live discussion. There are other ways to find the funds. And of course, this was a topic of discussion at Munich. It was a topic of discussion at the G7, but we must now move from discussion to action.
Sir Julian Lewis.
I'll resist the temptation of asking the Foreign Secretary if he shares my feeling of disgust at the spectacle of the leader of the free world showering praise and admiration on the killer. Instead, when he speaks to his counterparts, will he try and impress on them that the reason that George Kennan's containment policy, to which he rightly referred, was so successful in preventing the Cold War from turning into the Third World War, was that contentious territory was not demilitarized and was not left undefended. It worked in the case of Western Germany, and it will have to be the only way that Western Ukraine can equally be secured for the future.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, that ran right through Reagan and beyond, that containment strategy that he refers to. And in a sense, it is the conventional way to understand peace through strength. And we would do well to keep it at the front of our minds in the days and weeks ahead.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the international community must not allow the sovereign nation of Ukraine to be traded like a chess piece by powerful nations, particularly after their brave defence of freedom and the international rules-based system for themselves and the wider world? And that if we fail on this, we risk another peace in our time moment that would, sooner or later, endanger other countries and even our own.
Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman's right, and he knows that Ukrainians felt let down by the Budapest Memorandum. They felt brutally let down by the Minsk Agreement. They cannot be let down again. But he also knows, and we also know, because of that unbelievable Ukrainian spirit, that actually they would fight on with guerrilla warfare if need be. These are the most admirable of people fighting for their self-determination, and the United Kingdom will continue to stand with them.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Scottish National Party has stood alongside the people of Ukraine in solidarity, not just for the last 3 years, but for the last 10 years, since Putin, of course, invaded Crimea. And whilst I won't invite the Foreign Secretary to agree with me in the Chamber, I'm sure he does inside that President Trump's remarks in relation to Zelensky being a dictator were beyond repulsive. But surely what we all must know is that there is no deal that can be made with Vladimir Putin that he will not break. Does the Foreign Secretary not agree?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman has a point. Russia and Putin have been clear on the terms. And the terms that they want for peace have often included the removal of 14 members of the 32 NATO members. That's unacceptable. We've seen Finland and Sweden join more recently, and their preconditions for talks have been that Ukraine should effectively give up the territory that they are now in. Such demands, it seems to me, show an utter contempt for Ukrainian territorial integrity. They're not serious about discussions until they reconsider the criteria that we heard once again from Lavrov last week.
Tulip Siddiq.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituent and her son moved to this country under the Homes for Ukraine scheme. My constituent has a very stable job here, and her son is doing A-levels at the best maths school in London. My constituent is very worried that her 18-month visa extension will expire in the middle of her son's A-level exams. So could I ask the Foreign Secretary, what conversations is his department having with the Home Office to ensure that young Ukrainians who moved here through no fault of their own do not disrupt their education and can build a life for themselves?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and it puts on record the tremendous support the British people have given to Ukrainian refugees. And it allows me to say that there is still a war, there is still need for those people to seek sanctuary in our country. It's my assessment that Putin is not showing a serious willingness to negotiate, and it may be that negotiations go on for some time. So I'd want to reassure her constituent, but of course we're in close dialogue with my friend, the Home Secretary.
Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Some of us are old enough to remember Hungary in 1956. Some of us are old enough to remember Czechoslovakia in 1968. None of us, Madam Deputy Speaker, want to see Ukraine sacrificed on the same altar of expediency. So when the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister go to Washington, they will know that they carry with them the good wishes of almost all of this House. Ukraine is not for sale, can never be for sale, and this is not a transaction. The United Kingdom will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Foreign Secretary.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for reminding us of history, and he will know that in the 20th century, to the east, it was only the Russia-Japanese War that stopped Russia's imperial ambitions. To the south, it was the Crimean War. And of course, to the west, it was that containment strategy to which I referred, and of course, NATO. This is the history that is our best advisor as we approach the matter of peace.
Mark Sewitz.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I start by commending the people of Ukraine for resisting the murderous dictator Vladimir Putin for as long as they have. They are heroes. Almost every member of this House knows that if we fold in our support of Ukraine now, if we give Russia what it wants now, then Vladimir Putin will only come back for more. Our national security is at stake. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that it is in everyone's interests, Britain's, Europe's, and America's, to ensure that any potential peace deal includes Ukraine at the table?
Foreign Secretary.
Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That was heard loudly, of course, from President Zelensky, but all Europeans recognised it, and I'm pleased that Secretary of State Rubio, in my conversations with him, and indeed General Kellogg, have both underlined the importance of Ukraine being at that table.
Andrew George.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I very warmly welcome the Secretary of State's statement here today, and that although he perhaps can't use the language I'm about to use, I hope that when the Prime Minister and he meet Putin's appeaser in the White House later this week, I hope that he will remind him that if we have a special relationship, he keeps referring to a special relationship, it has to be based on truth, on respect for democracy, on respect for justice and respect for international law.
In the end, the United States is leader of the free world. President Trump has had an election in which I think 77 million people voted for him. He holds both seats, both houses on the Hill. And he's, of course, as you would expect, and indeed as my party were, buoyed up by that democratic mandate. And of course we will have the conversations with him over the coming days on a range of issues. And friends agree and can sometimes disagree. But I think it's definitely the case that we support his desire for bringing this horrendous war to an end. And we will now play our part in Europe to ensure that we raise defence spending, that Europe steps up to the burden sharing that is necessary, because President Trump's analysis also of the huge problems in the Indo-Pacific are correct. And we must recognise that successive US presidents have been clear about their responsibilities in relation to the Indo-Pacific.
Tim Rocker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite the astonishing 10 days that we've had, and I think we should be under no illusions that they have been astonishing, there has been reassurance to be found in the steadfast commitment of the government to Ukraine and the leadership that it has been showing. The Foreign Secretary alluded earlier to Vladimir Putin's penchant for lying. He lied about the invasion, he lied about Ukraine's territorial integrity, he lied about the rules of war, and he has, of course, abducted thousands of Ukrainian children. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that not only should Ukraine be at the centre of the negotiations, but that we should be clear-eyed about the character of the man that we are dealing with?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for mentioning those children that have been abducted. On the last two occasions that I have been in Ukraine, I have met with those children. Children that were viciously taken from their homes, and there was an attempt effectively to brainwash them from their histories. And we are supporting organisations that seek to get those children back and reunite them with their families. And I have also launched a Children in Care initiative, and I was very pleased to be with Madam Zelensky when I was last in Ukraine, supporting again vulnerable children with their foster families.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Deputy Speaker, does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the 2.5% of GDP ship has now sailed, and that we and our allies have to find the resources to spend 3% within a recognisable time frame? And when he's in Washington this week, will he discuss with his interlocutors how the billions of pounds he proposes to give Mauritius for taking on the Chagos Islands could be better served by being devoted to building and re-equipping our armed forces?
Foreign Secretary.
10 years ago, there were just 4 countries meeting the 2% commitment. Today, that has risen to 23. And of course, right across the alliance, countries are understanding that they have to do more. We will set out how we will do more very, very shortly. And as the matter today is Ukraine, you'll forgive me, I won't discuss issues to do with Bayat. I'm sure you'll have an occasion, oral questions tomorrow.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just over 3 years ago, I flew the penultimate UK mission into Kyiv to deliver material essential to the defence of Ukraine ahead of the illegal full-scale Russian invasion. Since then, Ukraine has been defending European security, the UN Charter and liberal democracy against Putin's assault on these shared interests and, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, the inalienable rights of life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that in order to free Ukraine from Putin's tyranny and imperialist ambition, and to ensure the words of the Declaration of Independence are realised for all, that UK leadership in the coordination of European and transatlantic allies is essential?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes, yes, yes. I say to my honourable friend, and I think all of us pay tribute to our armed forces, to his work in our armed forces, and it's because of that work over so many years, that sacrifice, that I think the spirit of this country guides us to stand solidly with Ukraine on a cross-party basis. He's right to pray and aid, those words that underpin our values and indeed global values as underpinned in the UN Charter. That is what we are fighting for, and we will not give up.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Does the Secretary of State regret recanting the original views that he expressed in assessing Trump? And can I urge him that when the time is right, and it certainly isn't any time now, he will consider following the example of Archbishop Cranmer by plunging the offending hand first into the flame?
Foreign Secretary.
This is a serious debate and a serious discussion, and I've said in a sense that's old news. There's so much news before us, and there's so much history to be forged. It requires diplomacy, it requires friendship, and it requires us understanding who the real threats are. And those real threats are those autocracies in the world that could do tremendous damage over the coming years, and I've always recognised that.
Frank McNally.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As has been replicated across the country, people in Coldfield and Belsill have opened their doors to those forced from their homes due to Putin's illegal attack, and public authorities have stepped up also. North Lanarkshire Council has provided homes and supported integration for more than 200 Ukrainian families at the High Courts Tower in my constituency, which has been recognised nationally for helping to deliver stability and belonging. As we continue to push for a just peace, and following my honourable friend from Hampstead and Highgate, will my right honourable friend commit to working with the Home Secretary, devolved governments and other key stakeholders to ensure safe harbour for those families so cruelly and viciously targeted by Putin's barbarism?
Foreign Secretary.
I can assure the right honourable gentleman that that will be the case. I continue to work closely with the Home Secretary. There has been a tremendous outreach of support across this country, and I recognise that and have seen it at work also in Scotland.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first of all, can I welcome the robust statement we've had from the Secretary of State today, and the way in which he has stood by Ukraine and committed the UK to standing by Ukraine. And I hope that he conveys the same message to President Trump, that by giving in to Putin, we don't just jeopardise peace in Ukraine, but across the whole of Europe. But what practical steps can he take, apart from the assurance he's given in the House today, to first of all ensure that Ukraine's interests are reflected in any negotiations? And secondly, given the stretched state of our own armed forces, what long-term security commitments can we give to Ukraine?
Secretary.
Oh, look, we have committed to $3 billion in support to Ukraine for as long as it lasts. They've asked for more munitions, we've supported them. They've asked for particular missile capability, we've supported them. And we will continue to do that because this war is being waged on the front line. It's a war of attrition. And we need, notwithstanding any discussions or talks about talks, we need to be there with them. And I can just guarantee the honourable gentleman that we will continue to do that.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was present at the Munich Security Conference, where it felt like the world changed around us and the consequences could not be more serious. I welcome our government's announcement today of fresh sanctions on Russia, and given the absence of some on the benches opposite, I'm sure the whole House will be able to agree that it is President Putin and not President Zelensky who is the dictator. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that we are indeed in a once-in-a-generation moment, and that the future of our own security here in the UK is bound up in Ukraine's security, and in the need to do what it takes to face down the aggression of Putin's Russia?
Foreign Secretary.
I'm very grateful to the honourable lady, and she's absolutely right. Because of the history of Russia and the former Soviet Union, we understand deeply that our own futures are bound up in Putin's ambitions. We also understand, by the way, that there are many valiant people resisting Putin in Russia. I met with Mrs. Navalny at the Munich Security Conference, and so our fight is not with the Russian people, it's to support the Russian people. Our fight is with Vladimir Putin.
Saki Bhatti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When Putin invaded 3 years ago, he thought it would be a matter of weeks. 3 years on, Ukraine is still standing. And I'm proud of how we as a House, as a nation, and many of my constituents stood up for Ukraine. And I commend them for that. My right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, asked a question around the sanctions, and I didn't hear an answer from the Foreign Secretary on this, so perhaps he'll be able to shed some light on this. When the Prime Minister meets with President Trump, will he be raising the issue of the new sanctions, which I welcome, and will we be urging the US to follow suit?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, we continue to discuss sanctions with all of our partners, and it was a topic that I discussed with G7 partners, and that included Secretary of State Rubio. We've imposed sanctions on over 2,100 individuals and entities. It's the most wide-ranging sanctions imposed on any major economy. And we believe that maximum pressure is required now at this time, and there have been indications from the United States that they would be willing to impose further sanctions on Russia. So, of course, that remains an issue under discussion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the important statement from the Foreign Secretary today, and indeed the comments from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, for this entire House should be united in our support for Ukraine. And as others have said, it is rather a shame that there is one party that has not shown up to this important statement. Ukrainians who have come to the UK since the war have made such an important contribution to our country. I met with Ola over the weekend, a Ukrainian Teessider, and she shared with me that many Ukrainians are facing great uncertainty. One of the reasons for that is because they are unable to access work and study because of the lack of Ukrainian GCSE. I wonder if the Foreign Secretary can discuss with DFE this issue to ensure that Ukrainians are able to access study and work. And if you will recognise at the dispatch box today the importance of that contribution that Ukrainians have made to our country.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. Of course, Ukrainians have been making a contribution across Europe and in our country for long before this war began. There has been a history between us and Ukrainians. He makes a very good point in relation to the Ukrainian language, but I might say I've met many Ukrainians and I admire the way that they've so quickly learnt the English language. But I will take forward the recommendation he makes to the Education Secretary.
Ben Lake.
Can I join others in commending the Ukrainian people for their bravery in the face of Russian aggression and indeed the government's steadfast support for the nation's sovereignty. The Foreign Secretary made reference in his statement to the need for European nations to contribute more to future security guarantees for the Ukrainian people. And can I ask him if he envisions that more bilateral and multilateral agreements between European allies might play a part in that endeavour, much in the vein of the Lancaster House treaties or indeed more latterly the Trinity House agreement?
Well, he's right. As the UK, we have sought to forge strong relationships with key partners across Europe. We look forward, once the new government is formed in Germany, to signing a new treaty with our German friends, to updating Lancaster House. So he's right that bilaterally this is very important. I believe that NATO is the central underpinning of European security, but we do need to work together across Europe to increase our industrial defence capability, and we do need to find more funds to increase our defence spending right across the European family, and that is something that I think you'll hear more about in the coming weeks and months.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary was absolutely right to say that if Russia is serious about a lasting peace, that it must respect Ukraine's sovereignty. But given that they have shown absolutely no signs of doing so, will he reiterate that we will stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine no matter what, and further reiterate, even for the members who have not chosen to be with us here today, that this country does not appease fascists, it opposes them?
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, and that is why, since February 2022, the United Kingdom's total military, economic and humanitarian support for Ukraine amounts to $12.8 billion. That is our commitment to Ukraine so far, and that commitment will continue.
Monica Harding.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am very proud that in my constituency of Eastern Walton, over 600 Ukrainians have been hosted through the Homes for Ukraine programme. And 3 years on, my constituents stand with the Ukraine. They know that Ukraine has protected Europe's front line for 3 years. They know that if Ukraine's fight is one that affects us all, and if Ukraine loses, Europe loses, and they know that Ukrainians are fighting for the values of our forebears, the British values of democracy and freedom. And so will the Foreign Secretary commit to stand by Ukraine, steadfast, even when others do not, and will he ensure that he points out in his meetings in Washington tomorrow the folly and the danger of the US administration's new approach to Russia?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and let me just say that the UK, of course, supports the US-led efforts to get a lasting peace in Ukraine that deters Russia from future aggression and ensures that Ukraine is at the table as we negotiate that peace. That is the issue that we will be discussing with President Trump, just as President Macron is discussing that issue today. And I'm quite sure that our assessment that Putin isn't ready, really, to negotiate on proper terms stand, but I admire the efforts to bring that about, and of course the US plays a central role in achieving that.
Kevin Bonavere.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today, we pay tribute to the people of Ukraine fighting not only for their own freedom, but for the freedom of all Europe. The Foreign Secretary said we must learn from history. Over 80 years ago, in Munich, this country and others talked away the future of Czechoslovakia without it being there and stripped it of its vital resources. And we all know the tragic consequences. Today, there can be no peace without Ukraine, and there can be no enduring peace without the security that this country and other NATO allies can give to it.
The Honourable Gentleman puts his remarks very well, and I agree with them.
Sir Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I can barely believe I've got to say this to the Foreign Secretary, but he'll be unaware that in past moments the United States has just voted against the UN resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine.
What?
I understand fully the position that the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister are in the approach they've got to take in Washington this week. But we do know that President Trump listens to people who last spoke to him. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary that he outlines two very important points. The first point is that European military assets, not NATO assets, European military assets are often used to support American operations in the Indo-Pacific, something that the American military really appreciate, how we put our shoulder to the wheel. So this isn't just the Americans only ever supporting Europe, we also help the Americans. And last week, I and several honourable members and noble members were at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Brussels, where it was made clear that at the Hague Summit, they are going to present what's actually needed for European defence rather than just targets of GDP. So may I also say to the Foreign Secretary to advise the Prime Minister that it will be important that he takes a position with the President of the United States to say if those demands do add up to more than 2.53% of GDP, that our country will set itself on a path within the time targets to achieve those.
Yeah. Just remind members that if we're going to get everybody in, shorter questions would be very helpful, and shortish answers, please. Foreign Secretary.
Well, he mentions the Indo-Pacific, and it's important that we remember AUKUS in relation to that and our critical partnership with Australia and the United States. And quite rightly, he mentions defence spending. Much has been said in this chamber, and much, I'm sure, will be said when we go to the United States.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for a very strong statement. He said that Ukraine's security is our security. Does he also agree with me that this is a fight for democracy, one where we need to tackle misinformation both at home and abroad, and where we need to maintain our steadfast commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty?
Well, I'm very grateful to the gentleman mentioning that, because there is a hybrid warfare taking place as we speak. Countries like Moldova are at the forefront of it, with sabotage and attacks constantly on their infrastructure, on their internet services, a hybrid warfare, and of course it's taking place against our own country. So he's absolutely right. This is not just a hard war and a hot war, it's a hybrid war, and we have to be vigilant.
Adrian Ramsey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Foreign Secretary's
statement. It is indeed important that we have cross-party support across this House, standing in solidarity with Ukraine and being clear that Ukraine must be front and centre of the peace talks which must take place. But it's deeply disturbing to see some of the comments that we've seen from President Trump, including the absurd claim that Zelensky is a dictator, the ridiculous suggestion that Ukraine started the war. So therefore, when the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister go to Washington later this week, will they make clear to President Trump that Ukraine must be at the centre of these peace talks and that the Ukrainian people have an absolute right to self-determination?
Yes, there must be no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine. As I've said, we've seen very little sign that Putin is abandoning his goal of subjugating Ukraine. Russia's continued to escalate this war, including through deploying, of course, DPRK troops and barbaric attacks daily on Ukrainians, innocent civilians and their infrastructure and energy supplies.
Josh Dean.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On Saturday, I joined Ukrainian families and residents in Bishop Stortford to remember those who have lost their lives and suffered throughout this conflict ahead of the 3rd anniversary. A reminder that in Hertford and Stortford, as across the country, we stand firmly with the Ukrainian people. So as we mark that 3rd anniversary, will the Foreign Secretary reiterate to the Ukrainian families who have found safety in my constituency, and indeed all Ukrainian people, that this government will continue to advocate for Ukraine's sovereignty and for it to be given a seat at the table right at the heart of any future negotiation?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman's constituency is a constituency I know well, and I'm very pleased to give his constituents that affirmation.
Alistair.
Deputy Speaker, no member of this House should be in any doubt as to who the aggressor is in this situation, as to who the dictator is, and as to who started this war. And no one should give cover to that dictator who started this war. The Prime Minister has said that he anticipates, if there's a peace, a post-peace situation, where there will be British troops on the ground in Ukraine, with what he termed a US backstop. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that the prospect of a US backstop would be greatly enhanced if the European nations began to more thoroughly shoulder the burden financially that has been shirked in recent years?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think that there was complacency in that post-Cold War period across the European families. And at this dispatch box, we've lamented that the United Kingdom has fallen to 2.3% of GDP. So he's right. This is the time to step up. This is the time to demonstrate peace through strength. And look, if you're in the Baltic nations, you're very, very clear about your responsibility at this time.
Jonathan Hinder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And like the Foreign Secretary, I am incredibly proud of the role that the UK has played in supporting Ukraine. I'm especially proud of the role my constituents in Pendle and Clitheroe have played in welcoming Ukrainians into their homes and into our community. But if we are to stop Putin, Britain must get real on defence. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that we must now urgently rearm well beyond the existing 2.5% target, and so that with our European allies we can protect our precious democracies?
Well, as I said, we'll set out defence spending, further defence spending shortly.
Claire Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Those NATO countries bordering Russia are understandably stepping up their defences without waiting for others to take action. So can the Foreign Secretary update the House on what discussions he has had with those countries?
Well, I met with the Polish Foreign Minister at the Munich Security Conference and Baltic colleagues to discuss these very same issues. and she's absolutely right. Those countries have been aware of the threat for some time, and it allows me to say that when we talk about security guarantees in relation to Ukraine, of course, it's also important to recognise NATO's eastern flank, and many of those countries would have to know that they are supported on efforts to give US security guarantees, and that's why the US backstop is so important.
Colum Eastwood.
Last week, along with other members of this House, I met with Ukrainian parliamentarians at the OSCE in Vienna. The opposition MPs from Ukraine made it very clear from their perspective that they do not support Donald Trump's call for an election in Ukraine while they're defending against Russian aggression. Will the Foreign Secretary, in his conversations with the US administration this week, make it very clear there's only one dictator in this conflict, and his name is Vladimir Putin?
Yes, of course.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the third anniversary of Putin's brutal and full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I welcome the United Nations just passed a resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. However, in the last 15 minutes, and it will shock this House, it was opposed by Russia and the United States. And it's quoted in the press, this is an appeasement by Trump. It's a direct stab in the back. Will the Foreign Secretary condemn what's happened just now in the United Nations with the United States joining Russia in not standing up for the resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine?
Well, we're proud to have co-sponsored the General Assembly resolution proposed by Ukraine in support of a just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter. The UN proposed it, voted for it, and we will stand forever with Ukraine.
Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, Ukrainians in Welwyn Hatfield came together in sombre recognition of the third anniversary of the Russian invasion. I want to pay tribute to them for their bravery, resilience, and how they are going about rebuilding their lives as valued members of our community. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I also said to them that in this House I would speak the truth and stand up for those people as best I could. And would the Foreign Secretary agree with me that we need to say loud and clear from this dispatch box that there was one person who was an aggressor, there was one person who is responsible for the death and destruction, and there is emphatically one person who started this war, and his name is Vladimir Putin?
The Honourable Gentleman's absolutely right. And you know, when I was in Kyiv, very close to President Zelensky's office, there is an apartment block that was blown up in a few weeks ago, and a couple lying in their bed asleep were killed. That is the awfulness of this war. And of course, he will also recall that when the Prime Minister visited, Putin also sought to fire missiles into Ukraine. It's a brutality that is grim and unbelievable, and of course we must continue to stand up to it.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Madam Deputy Speaker, in an early response to the Right Honourable Member for Aberdeen South, the Foreign Secretary said that Russia does not respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But I want to bring him to his comments in his statement from the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. Given the news that we've just heard in relation to the UN resolution, when the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth says that the US wants to see a sovereign, prosperous Ukraine, how confident is the Foreign Secretary that the US is also going to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine?
I'm very pleased that the US is attempting to bring this horrendous war to an end. That does require conversations with Russia. I think they're hard conversations, and I'm not sure the Russians are ready to properly negotiate, but I admire the attempt to try. And it's important that Ukraine is at the table. It's important that Europe steps up with the burden sharing and increases its defence. And those are the issues that we'll be discussing with President Trump in the coming days.
Paul Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Online propaganda from the Kremlin has become a disturbing reality. Social media, especially on platforms like Facebook and X, have been flooded with the claim that Ukraine is solely responsible for the war. It's extraordinary. May I ask the Secretary of State what measures are being taken to combat the propaganda being spread by governments that blame the Ukrainian people for the conflict?
Well, these are important issues, and I know that they're issues that preoccupy my honourable friends in the Department for Culture, Media and Support and my honourable friend in the Department for DCIT, and they are looking further at these issues and what more we can do.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has said this morning that Russia doesn't hold all the cards, and I welcome the Foreign Secretary's announcement of the further sanctions that are being brought in. But can I ask him to assure this House that he will work on all international and national levels to ensure that President Putin doesn't get a new hand that actually allows him at an international level to proceed with bluff and bluster and bullying that actually brings the Ukrainian people to their knees, which we haven't seen to date, and that this House and this government will stand resolutely with the people of Ukraine.
Well, the honourable gentleman's right. It's why I met with G7 foreign ministers and we were able to issue a joint statement on Ukraine 10 days ago. It's why I discussed this issue at the G20 in South Africa last week, and I'm proud of the work of our diplomats in the UN General Assembly today, where we have seen many countries come together in support of Ukraine and that resolution that had to be passed.
Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today of all days, we must remember that over 1 million have been killed or wounded in Ukraine since the illegal invasion. Now, I just came from talking to a group of Ukrainian individuals who support Ukrainian veterans. They welcome the medical expertise that the UK has provided the Ukrainian military hospitals. However, there are also thousands of civilian casualties, and they're asking if the UK can also provide medical expertise in the civilian hospitals. Will the Minister look into whether the UK can provide this support as well?
Well, I'm very pleased of the decisions that have been made by myself and the Defence Secretary to support Ukrainian armed forces at this time with medical support. I am happy to look at the issues facing civilians. These are issues that, of course, we discuss in a pan-European context, but she's right to raise these very same issues.
Seamus Logan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is surely right that it cannot be left to those who have obviously no real care or concern for Europe's well-being to have the sole voice in negotiating the future of Ukraine and, by extension, the future of Europe. So, will the Foreign Secretary, in his discussions with President Trump, convey that Ukraine must be present at the table when these negotiations are taking place? And will he also convey the disgust of this House that the USA voted, along with North Korea and Russia, against Ukrainians' resolution at the UN today?
Well, we've been really clear. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Ukraine must have a seat at the table. It is their destiny that is in the mix in any discussions taking place.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. So can I very much welcome the Secretary of State's strong words, commitment and strength and fortitude that he has shown today. Whilst I will always welcome the end to war, what I am unable to forget is the mass murder of the Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war by the Russian armed forces during the fight for an occupation of the city of Bucha, three days after the invasion started. Just to remind the House, girls as young as 8 and women as old as 80 were raped. 3 Baptist pastors of churches were murdered. 9 children were murdered under the age of 18. They were all put into a basement, Madam Deputy Speaker, and then they were poured in with petrol and they were burnt alive. So what I want, and what the people that I represent want to see, is ensure that any deal includes accountability for those who committed these dreadful, dreadful war crimes and so many others that are still unknown.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for reminding us of the massacre at Bucha. It was a privilege that I had to visit Bucha and to spend time with the community there, to spend time with families and victims, loved ones. It was an horrendous act It was a criminal, barbaric, inhumane act. And he's right that we have also in this country led on the issue of justice and accountability, and we will not let that go.
Bless you. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for the statement this afternoon. Members who wish to leave the chamber can do so quickly and quietly.